humans are the current #1 build in the meta, but they haven't always reigned supreme. In fact, at first they were one of the least powerful builds in the meta, and it took several buffs, refinements, and tweaks before the human became even remotely threatening within its home server of Africa. So today, we're going to break down all the different variations of the human build throughout the history of Outside and discuss their unique traits, stats, and abilities, with the hope of demonstrating why some of these skill tree choices worked, while others couldn't compete. The first players to unlock the human class were a group of African primate mains that switched from the knuckle-walking quadrupedal build to a bipedal one. It's important to note that at this point, they hadn't sacrificed their arboreal mobility perks yet, and relied heavily on their ability to climb to escape danger. The top tiers at the time were all large terrestrial mammal builds far too strong for Australopithecus to challenge them, so their only option was to avoid them. It might seem counterintuitive to switch to a bipedal build when your playstyle is centered around the arboreal zone, but the reason this was so crucial was because it freed up their hands to be able to carry items back to their tree. This was the first step towards refining the cooperative, loot-sharing playstyle that have made humans so dominant in the current meta. Now, you might be surprised to learn that the devs have nerfed humans in the past. The tree-dwelling strategy was seen as a cheap way to avoid dealing with other players, and so the devs decided to reduce the number and size of trees in the Africa server. This forced humans to ditch their arboreal strategy and spec into ground-based abilities, and for a while, humans got absolutely bodied by other players. Even with the ability to use items and create tools, the other builds in the region, like saber-tooths and giant hyenas, were far too strong for humans to deal with. They had to rely solely on the thieving skill to get by, but this disadvantage was slightly mitigated by their newfound ability to crack bone using tools, letting them scavenge for marrow after big cats had finished with the kill. Once humanity had scraped together enough evolution points by scavenging, they finally got to level up some of their stats and give themselves the ability to survive by hunting rather than scavenging. They spec'd into longer legs and less body hair, allowing them to finally unlock one of the human's most powerful signature abilities, sweating. Sweating allows the player to recharge their stamina even while moving, whereas other builds are forced to stop and use the pant ability to recharge stamina. They could justify putting all of their evolution points into mobility rather than power, because by this point they'd also leveled up their crafting enough to make spears, the staple best-in-slot two-handed weapon until the invention of gunpowder. A sustainable source of meat is worth a lot more XP than fruit or scavenged marrow. So much so that this let humans finally start leveling up their intelligence to a truly staggering level, promoting both cooperation and innovation. But once again, nerfs were on the way. Just before the Ice Age balance patch hit, a faction of the human player base migrated servers, establishing themselves in the Europe server. Most of the others stayed in Africa. The Ice Age patch hit, and it led to two very different changes in the two servers that the humans were playing on. In Europe, as you probably expect, the overworld temperature dropped and ice damage became a threat. The humans, as well as most of the other top players there, spec'd into bulkier builds that could survive the cold better. In short, the update didn't really affect them too badly. This group became known as the Neanderthal faction. The humans that remained in Africa, now known as the Sapiens faction, faced a much worse update. Ironically, during the Ice Age, Africa got hotter and drier. The large herbivores humans had such a good matchup against all left, and the human player base in Africa was reduced to the brink of extinction, with player counts below 10,000. They survived by leveling up their fishing skill, scavenging for shellfish and other low XP sources, as they too made their escape from Africa. When they finally escaped Africa, they were finally back in a server that they could thrive in, but they had competition. Neanderthals had the highest stats of any human build in history. They had bigger brains, more girthy bodies, stronger muscles, just undeniably a more viable build compared to Sapiens. So by this point I'm guessing you're wondering, well, if Neanderthals were more powerful, why is it that eventually the Neanderthals lost the faction war to the Sapiens? It turns out that their physical superiority was actually their downfall. Neanderthals and Sapiens had a very different hunting strategy when it comes to taking down large herbivores. Neanderthals had the strength to defeat them with melee combat, and had the defense and HP to be able to take a hit or two even from some of the Ice Age's strongest herbivore builds. They were also fast enough to be able to close the distance between themselves and their targets. This all sounds awesome, but there's one key detail in this plan that you might have noticed. Since Neanderthals were fit enough to take on these herbivores face to face, they didn't have to invent ranged weapons. Sapiens, on the other hand, would get one shot if they tried to take on behemoths like mammoths or woolly rhinos in close combat. Thankfully, even though their brains weren't as big as Neanderthals, it was still more than enough for them to be able to use the aforementioned crafting skill to create the first ranged weapon, the atlatl. Atlatls are a relatively simple yet effective item that allows the user to launch spears over twice as far. This was critical for the survival of Sapiens as it allowed them to match the DPS of the Neanderthal, but also stay out of range of a potentially devastating counterattack. Sapiens also tended to have bigger party sizes. Neanderthals were less social and tended to stick to small, tight-knit groups, while Sapiens formed much larger communities that could control much larger territories. Eventually, even though Neanderthals were the better fighters, they were the ones failing to find enough XP to survive. And this is where their physical might became a huge detriment. The bigger you are, the more energy you need to survive. And so the Neanderthals' strong, powerful bodies eventually became unsustainable. Most of them were defeated in combat or starved, although a few did end up actually switching factions and joining with the Sapiens. But finally, after defeating their most dangerous opponent, humans were free to dominate the game as the new top tiers. They mastered several key advanced techniques such as agriculture, archery, and sailing, allowing them to push the meta far past what other builds ever thought possible. You'd think that they would all work together to rule the game, but unfortunately many of them ended up engaging in PvP with each other. It kinda makes sense given that other players are hardly even a challenge, but nonetheless, infighting is their biggest weakness right now. Anyways, hopefully that gives you a better background on the history of the game's most overpowered build. Human beings. Are they as overpowered as the game's community would lead you to believe? Short answer, yeah. They're the most meta-defining build of all time, and the undisputed top build in the current expansion. But believe it or not, this wasn't always the case. Humans used to get bodied left and right on a daily basis by other players. And it took a pretty long time before the player base learned how to actually make use of the human build's unique abilities. The story of the humans' rise to dominance is a really interesting one. And so today, we're going to do an in-depth look at the humans' abilities, their strengths, and their weaknesses. Because yes, they do have weaknesses. We'll also go over notable matchups, and finally look at the steps human players took in order to reach their dominant status. First, their unique abilities. I touched on this topic in my video about primates, but I'll recap here and also go into more detail. First off the bat, we have their ability to throw things. Other builds can throw things, but humans can do so harder, faster, and further than anyone else. The reason for this is their body structure. Bipedal builds are tough to balance, both in the game development sense and the center of mass sense. Throwing an item with any real force behind it requires serious balance, achieved only by having shorter arms and longer legs. This is why humans can launch projectiles at deadly speeds, whereas other primates kinda just lob things without putting much effort into it. If they tried to, they would knock themselves over. Even if chimpanzees could figure out how to craft a spear, there's no way they could throw it hard enough to deal any significant damage. Next, their stamina regeneration. Humans can chase down anything. You try to run from a human, you might outspeed them initially, but you'll run out of stamina much sooner than they will, and they'll catch up to you while you're in your weakened state. This is partially because of their superior balance again, but mostly it's because of the human build's unique choice to not spec into fur. This gives them access to the extremely broken ability Sweat. Every other current build that's decent at distance running recharges stamina by using the move Pant. This works great, but it does require the user to stop running. Sweat, on the other hand, works better while moving, massively extending the distance a human player can run. They've got a few other important abilities that are essential to their kit, but aren't unique to humans. Their ability to speak is unique among mammals, but some birds can pull it off too. In humans, the ability to speak allows them to use one of their signature moves, Teach, which drastically boosts skill point gain, mitigating the main penalty a player receives upon getting a game over. Humans and birds also share another unique trait, which is being able to stand upright. Standing upright is extremely useful for dealing with stealth builds that might normally be using tall grass to hide. Tool use also might be thought of as a human-exclusive move, and it certainly is the most effective in humans, but it turns out a pretty wide array of other builds can also do it. Birds, primates, cephalopods, and even fish can use tools on occasion. But sweating and throwing, uniquely human. Now onto their weaknesses. And yes, it's true that currently most human players can subvert these with their crafting skill. But it's important to recognize that without equipment, the human build isn't necessarily unstoppable. The decision to not have fur granted humans a massive buff to mobility at the cost of stealth. In the mammal faction, fur is a prerequisite to all the major stealth abilities like camouflage, and lack of stealth abilities means getting in close on their targets is a serious challenge. The human build's lack of fur also means they have very low defense, both from physical attacks and from environmental effects. Bare skin offers almost zero armor, to the point where even players from lower weight classes have no trouble dealing damage to humans. And Bearskin also takes quite a bit of damage from the sun too. Humans are also pretty limited when it comes to the power stat. Physically, they're the weakest of the great apes, and don't really have any good options for dealing damage. They lack the classic high damage bite attack that nearly every other non-herbivorous build relies on, instead having to resort to blunt attacks like punch and kick, which we all know aren't very effective against builds that have thick fur or skin. The last major weakness I can see is that they're pretty bad at dealing with stealth. The lack of night vision means darkness can really hamper their ability to locate targets, and their lack of a strong sense of smell means camouflage is especially useful against them. Okay, now let's talk about matchups. Obviously, a key feature of the human build is being able to craft equipment. Given basic equipment like low-level armor and hunting gear, the human's best matchup is going to be medium-large mammals. Unlike blunt damage, piercing damage is quite effective versus builds with thick hide, but on defense they're actually pretty awful. A human's only option on defense against a large mammal is intimidation, unless they've got some crazy high-level equipment, but I'll make a video on power creep later. The classic human equipment cannot stop a charging tank main unless the intimidate attempt works. But overall, this matchup is one of the reasons humans became top tier. Hardly any builds have favorable matchups against tanks. But that's not to say humans don't have their counters though. As I said before, stealth can be really effective against them due to their lack of a keen sense of smell and night vision. Humans have the ability to win pretty much any fight as long as they've got time to prepare, but taken by surprise, humans have a lot fewer options. Another thing humans have trouble dealing with is flight. Even when a human has a ranged weapon, players with high aerial mobility are pretty safe during flight. Now, as far as I know, there aren't any bird builds powerful enough to one-shot humans, which is important because blunt attacks like punches are actually quite effective against birds. Birds have hollow bones that are resistant to tension and torsion, but not compression. This is the opposite of mammal bones, which are resistant to compression and tension, but not torsion. The point is, birds aren't the best choice against humans, but flight has been unlocked by 4 different classes in the game. Birds, which we just discussed, aren't a good choice. Bats, which do even less damage than birds. Reptiles, which unfortunately had their aerial builds banned in patch 1.3.1, and insects. Flying eusocial insects have by far the best matchup versus humans in the entire game. Humans have 0 counterplay against a swarm of stinging insects. I mean, sure, there are special items that they can use to combat swarms if they're prepared, but the amount of human mains who've chosen that as one of their prestige abilities is pretty small. Humans' lack of fur means they have no innate defense against stings. Stings also have the chance to proc the Amphylaxis debuff, which can actually lead to a game over. And it's for this reason that the high score for human eliminations belongs to the Africanized honeybee, known better by its community-given name, the killer bee. And even if the stings don't proc the allergic reaction effect, they will still definitely achieve their primary goal of dropping their resolve to 0 and granting you control over the territory. And we can see that lately the viability of killer bees has only been growing now that they've expanded their territory outside of Africa. Which brings me to my main point. Are humans overpowered? Well, just like the Africanized honeybee, humans really only became OP once they escaped the African server and invaded other areas. Notice how humans took down megafauna across every terrestrial server except Africa. The African tank mains have the matchup experience and counterplay options to deal with the vast array of skills humans have access to. But the rest of the community was totally unprepared to deal with the rapid invasion of new human mains invading their competitive scene. In other words, the devs could have prevented the massive destabilization of the current meta if they'd region-locked humans. Staying competitive in the meta requires a good player constantly be leveling up their skills. There's no better example of this than the rapid rise to dominance that humans experienced. Dinosaurs were some of the most powerful builds to ever be introduced to the game, while other factions like the Mammal Guild and Arthropod Guild have come up with some pretty impressive ones. On land, nothing has yet topped the sheer power of the Reptile Guild's greatest achievements. Even though their massive size is perhaps their most notable trait, there was also a ton of variety in the abilities and combat strategies that these builds employed. And so today I think it's finally time to release my dinosaur tier list. Obviously there's a ton of dinosaur builds, so there's no way I can cover all of them, but I definitely will try to hit the important ones. It's worth noting that the reign of the dinosaur faction lasted more than twice as long as the reign of the mammal faction that supplanted them. And so during this huge stretch of time, dinosaur mains basically tried out every conceivable strategy, and that's why there are so many builds to talk about. But as always, we'll start from the bottom of the tier list and move up from there. At the bottom we've got Dryosaurus and Camptosaurus, two very similar herbivore builds with an interesting stat spread. Dinosaurs are known for their immense strength, but neither of these builds boast any sort of offensive capabilities. Instead, they have a modest but below average defensive spread, decent mobility, and above average intelligence for a dinosaur. These builds took advantage of how powerful the other herbivore builds were by sticking by the bulkier ones and relying on them to defend the herd. They also took advantage of the fact that they were faster than other herbivores, even though their mobility was lower than most predator builds. Their higher intelligence granted them more advanced perception, letting them function as the herd lookouts. But nonetheless, these builds were helpless on their own, and were easy targets for predator mains if they were ever caught undefended. Their lack of self-sufficiency puts them in F tier in my opinion. I think they realized this though, because later on, this faction started speccing into either extra armor on their heads, or spikes on their thumbs, giving them much better options for dealing with aggressive players. In D tier, we've got two carnivore builds, the first being Coelophysis. Coelophysis was one of the first dinosaur builds that the devs introduced, and like all of the early dinosaurs, it really was nowhere near the power level of the ones that would be added to the game later in the Jurassic and Cretaceous expansions. The only reason it became such a popular and dominant build was because it starved and dehydrated more slowly than its non-dinosaur rivals. And this isn't to say that it didn't struggle to succeed too, it absolutely did, and often had to resort to team killing just to get by.
Betrayal.
It sort of dominated the early dino meta by default, so I'm not going to rate it any higher than D tier. Also in D tier we have Spinosaurus. Spinosaurus is a unique build that specced heavily into fishing abilities and aquatic adaptations, including the rare ability of electroreception, which helped it catch fish players even when they were in stealth mode. This is great for that specific application, but Spinosaurus mains weren't actually fully aquatic. They couldn't breathe underwater and still had to spend plenty of their gameplay dealing with the challenges of being a terrestrial build. And unfortunately, their stats and abilities leave a lot to be desired in terms of contending with the terrestrial meta at that time. Because they'd spent so many evolution points adapting their build to be able to fish, they'd secured themselves a unique niche at the cost of being able to hold their own in general combat. They'd get bodied by most other carnivore mains and outsped by most herbivore mains, leaving them in an awkward position. If they'd had more time, they might have been able to gain enough experience to spec into a fully aquatic build, but unfortunately the devs decided to up the overworld temperature, raising the sea levels but drying up the rivers, leaving the Spinosaurus player base without a niche. The lesson here is that if you ever find yourself speccing into the playstyle of an amphibian, you may want to reconsider how you're spending your evolution points. Last in D tier we have the Hadrosaurs. Now I don't have a ton to say about these builds. Generally their main game plan is pretty simple, see a predator coming and run away. This is pretty similar to the Dryosaurus and Camptosaurus playstyle I mentioned in F tier, but instead of relying on the more powerful herbivores to defend them, they had the HP required to shrug off a hit or two, and actually had the mobility required to escape, assuming they saw the attack coming. Overall, this build was pretty easy to play, but had a low skill ceiling as well, since they had no actual combat abilities. All in all, there's a reason players consider Hadrosaurs more forgettable among dinosaur builds. In C tier, we've got two of the most famous Jurassic builds. The first is Stegosaurus. Taking a quick look at the Stegosaurus' stats, it's clear that this build was extreme on many fronts. It had one of the lowest intelligence levels of any dinosaur, and also didn't exactly have much in terms of mobility either. However, it had pretty incredible combat stats and powerful abilities to back it up. Most notably, its backplates and Thagomizer. Their backplates significantly reduce the chance of an attacker scoring a critical hit against them, since it's much harder to bite down on a Stegosaurus' weak point when there are plates in the way. Their backplates can also be flushed with blood to grant a large intimidation buff, which works great against predator and herbivore mains alike. The Thagomizer is one of the most unique weapons of any dinosaur build. The Thagomizer has one of the highest critical hit chances of any weapon in the game, often dealing enough damage to one-shot most players. Because it's a tail spike, this attack has a lot of reach, making approaching a defending Stegosaurus player extremely difficult. However, the strategy was by no means perfect. Their low mobility made fleeing from battle impossible, so if an enemy did know how to subvert its defenses, Stegosaurus mains would be out of options, and since their tails weren't long enough to cover an attack from the front, that was often their downfall. Thankfully, their base game plan was relatively simple, so their low intelligence didn't hinder them too much. Also in C tier, we have every Stegosaurus main's arch-enemy, Allosaurus. The Allosaurus build was unique in that it actually invested very little into the bite attack, only having the bite strength of a lion. Instead, Allosaurus dealt damage by using its head like a battle axe, swinging its open jaw down onto an enemy player. This dealt heavy damage but was nowhere near the devastating power of some of the top tier dinosaur combat moves. It had the highest top speed of any build during its time, but had relatively low stamina, meaning it could only sprint for a short time, also similar to lions today. While one-on-one, Allosaurus tended to get bodied by the stronger herbivore players of its time. In packs they could take down just about anything. Overall, a solid mid-tier, whose strategies got expanded upon and refined by the later dinosaur builds. In B-tier we have a few builds which did the exact opposite of what Allosaurus did, in that they put a ton of evolution points into a single combat tactic. First, the build which spec'd into the Claw skill tree, granting it the longest claws to ever exist in the game, Therizinosaurs. Therizinosaurs were excellent in 1v1 combat, because their claws gave them incredible reach and damage, perfect for slicing at the heads of carnivore mains that were trying to bite them. Their slash attack was the strongest the game had ever seen. In fact, they put so many points into the Claw skill tree that they had none left over for teeth or mobility, and were actually forced to change teams from the carnivore side to the herbivore side, making them the only build from the theropod faction to opt not to be a predator. This actually worked out really well for them, because they no longer had to compete with the other predator mains for XP, and were also taller than most herbivore players typically seen in the forest biomes. Sure, they were lacking in intelligence and mobility, and also couldn't actually gain any experience from the enemies that they defeated with their claws, but all in all, they had a surprisingly effective strategy. Not a perfect defense, as they were definitely still vulnerable to coordinated assaults, but definitely an above average build. On the opposite end of the spectrum from Allosaurus and Therizinosaurs, both of which had either weak or non-existent bite damage, we have the carnivore build that put all of its evolution points into maxing out the bite attack, the Tyrannosaurus Rex. T-Rex had the most powerful bite attack in the history of the game, able to take out any player it was able to bite in a single hit. This also gave it the ability to crush bone, letting it access the XP-rich marrow inside, similar to what hyenas do in today's meta. T-Rex was a hybrid between a predator and scavenger build. It didn't have the greatest luck taking down the heavily armored herbivores of the Cretaceous expansion, but it could certainly defeat them if the T-Rex players worked in a group, and as a scavenger, its massive size gave it the ability to steal kills from other carnivore players who had no hope of surviving its devastating bite if they got in its way. T-Rex did however have to sacrifice all of its other offensive strengths in order to maximize its bite damage. Its arms were so short that its claw attack had pathetic range, making them useless both for holding prey and fighting rivals for territory. And it also wasn't particularly fast outside of short bursts of speed, so if players saw it coming, which wasn't that hard because of its massive size, they wouldn't have too tough a time avoiding it. Still, with team strats, it was near unstoppable, and it always had the option to fall back on scavenging, so it was definitely a solid high tier. The last B tier build I want to talk about is Triceratops. In terms of defense in a single direction, no build has ever come close to Triceratops. Their horns can deal massive damage in a single swing, even to giant carnivore builds like T-Rex. Looking at its stats, it's pretty clear that going head to head with this thing would end badly. However, one thing I've noticed is that players nowadays fail to remember its main drawback, low intelligence. This thing was pretty close to a modern day opossum in terms of brain power, and as many of you should know from my Australia video, marsupials are some of the least intelligent mammals. People assume Triceratops behaved similar to a modern day elephant, since both are about the same size and sport powerful front-facing weaponry. However, the herd behavior that makes elephants so untouchable by predators was absent in the Triceratops build, as they were mostly solitary, and this was due to their low intelligence stat. Because of that, they were highly vulnerable from being attacked from behind, or from multiple angles at once. Triceratops' low intelligence also meant that it was easily tricked into walking into ambushes set by carnivore mains, which pretty much always meant a game over for the Triceratops. As powerful as this build is, and it is powerful, don't get me wrong, I think it's definitely not a top tier dinosaur and caps out at B tier. Okay, so in A tier we've got the dinosaurs which were a bit smarter about how they invested their evolution points. First we have the Dromaeosaurs, the faction of dinosaurs that includes builds like Velociraptor, Deinonychus, and Utahraptor. These players made an interesting choice to forego the gigantism ability that made dinosaurs so dominant in the first place, and try their hand at more of an evasive rushdown playstyle, sacrificing both their HP and defense stats to buff their mobility and DPS as best they could. Most notably, they spec'd into buffing a single claw on each foot, which had two important functions, the first being that it could deal massive slash and stab type damage, and the second being that it gave them the ability to hook onto players that they were targeting using the pounce attack. Overall, this build had much higher damage than normal for a build that size, and could easily take down players in a much higher weight class, especially if they attacked in a group, which they often did. They had the ability to weave in and out of their opponent's attack range easily, letting them bait out and dodge attacks. The one main drawback to this build was that if it ever got careless, they could easily take lethal damage in a single hit. But overall, this faction was one of the most successful at the time and easily A tier. Also in A tier we have Carcharodontosaurus, a build very similar to T-Rex in terms of appearance, but with a slightly different plan of attack. Instead of investing purely into bite force, maxing out base damage, Carcharodontosaurus spent its evolution points speccing into advanced serrated teeth. This gave their bite attack an increased chance to cause the heavy bleed status effect, which would drain the target's HP and stamina over time. This was more cost effective than pure bite force, and let them retain enough evolution points to spec into claws too, giving them a more well-rounded combat style that could still cause lethal damage from a single bite. This strategy is similar to the one seen employed by the Komodo dragon player base of today's meta. Carcharodontosaurus was also one of the tankier carnivore builds and could shrug off a hit or two even from the builds that would normally devastate anything that they landed a hit on. This made them extremely good at PvP against the other carnivore builds at the time, making them an easy high tier candidate. The next build I have in A tier is Ankylosaurus, perhaps the best tank build ever to exist in the game. This build essentially took the Stegosaurus strategy and cranked it up to the most extreme it could. Instead of backplates for intimidation, the Ankylosaur players spec'd into armor, and instead of tail spikes they opted for a club. Their armor was so impenetrable that it made attacks from even the strongest carnivore mains pretty laughable. While their club didn't have a high crit chance like the tail spikes did, it did do massive damage that could shatter bone, capable of crippling any player unfortunate to take a direct hit from it. Ankylosaurus was near invincible except that it had one glaring flaw. Despite all of its defense and power, it was completely helpless if a player managed to flip it over. For that reason I can't place it in top tier, because a good top tier will have no surefire counterplay. Last in A tier we have Troodon. The Troodon build was the only dinosaur build whose core strategy was based around the intelligence stat. Sure, other dinosaurs used team strategies or had advanced perception skills, both of which require some usage of intelligence, but Troodon was the only one to specifically tailor their build around having its brain be its best weapon. Troodon had to sacrifice a lot to get this. High intelligence requires a lot of calories to maintain, so getting the kills required to sustain both a large size and a large brain was impossible, meaning that they had to give up gigantism as a trait. So instead of powerful dagger-like claws, Troodon opted for smaller but opposable claws that could be used to pick up objects. This severely cut its potential in combat, but gave it a lot of options in terms of manipulating its environment to, for example, set up traps to catch players that would otherwise be able to evade them. It's very possible that if non-avian dinosaurs weren't banned in the Meteor Strike balance patch, Troodon players would have eventually leveled up their intelligence enough to become top tiers, similar to humans. But even though it was starting to gain the power to dominate its environment, it still had no way to combat the other top tiers aside from just running away, so it definitely wasn't S tier. In S tier, we have the most overpowered dinosaur faction of all, the Sauropods. Sauropods had every tool they needed to counter all other dinosaur builds. They had the maximum HP stat possible for a terrestrial build, and because they used the herd strategy, oftentimes this meant that if a sauropod player was caught off guard and was under attack by several carnivore players, it could usually tank enough hits that its teammates would have time to rescue it. And of all the dinosaurs, sauropods also had the largest attack range. Their whip-like tails may have not had the same damage per hit that Stegosaurus or Ankylosaurus did, but they were still plenty powerful, able to knock down enemies well out of reach of a counterattack. And if they did get too close, a sauropod's stomp attack was literally the most devastating move in the game, knocking the target down and dealing lethal damage. Lastly, their extreme height gave them a massive advantage for avoiding stealth attacks, as they could see much further than other players. In terms of land superiority, sauropods truly were the most overpowered dinosaurs of all time. It's unfortunate that the devs chose to ban the dinosaurs during the KT balance patch, but alas, the meta was getting stale, so I understand why. Hopefully you enjoyed this look back at the Mesozoic meta. If you enjoy watching videos about dinosaurs, there are a bunch of great documentaries I can recommend. For example, if you're curious about Troodon and why it was the smartest dinosaur ever, I have to recommend Leaps in Evolution, a documentary detailing the evolution of brains and intelligence. But if you just want a good, fun dinosaur story, one of my personal favorites is The Ballad of Big Al, a documentary that follows the life story of a single Allosaurus as it learns to hunt and survive in the Jurassic. Fish are one of the most diverse factions in the entire game. They are extremely popular among both casual and competitive players, and make up the vast majority of the aquatic player base. And with so many different potential fish builds to choose from, it can be difficult to know which builds are actually competitively viable in the current meta. So today, we're going to go through the tier list of fish. This will by no means be a comprehensive tier list. I mean, there are more than 3,000 variants of the Catfish build alone. Still, by highlighting the standout builds in both high and low tiers, hopefully I can give you a good understanding of where the fish faction fits into the current meta. And if there's a fish I didn't include, hopefully by seeing my logic in this video, you'll be able to evaluate that fish build yourself. Oh, also, quick disclaimer, since I've already made a shark tier list, I'm omitting sharks from this video. But before we dive into the tier list, first I want to give you an overview of the abilities commonly found in the fish faction, as well as some background on the history of the fish build. So the basic fish build doesn't have much in terms of unique perks or abilities, which is actually great as it means that each player has a lot of room for customization. The basic fish build is most famous for its use of the fin and gill abilities, both of which offer huge advantages in water while predictably being entirely useless on land. Back during the Devonian expansion, long before the Vertebrate faction had unlocked terrestrial builds, fish were the top tier build in the game, having a crushing matchup against the top arthropods, their main competitors. In today's meta though, fish have to compete with a lot more than just arthropods, and typically place below the top marine builds like cetaceans and cephalopods. And with the nerfs to the Placoderm armor ability that fish used to have access to, fish have had to get creative with their game strategies in order to survive the current meta. Now let's get into the tier list to see which strategies and abilities are worth speccing into if you're a fish player. Seahorses are an extremely strange build with the lowest mobility stat of any fish in the game. This mobility stat is due entirely to their strange choice to spec into the prehensile tail ability at the cost of all but one of their fins. Now don't get me wrong, the prehensile tail ability can be extremely useful, especially for arboreal builds that use them to tether themselves to trees while keeping their hands and legs free for foraging. For a marine build though, I think there are better choices available. All the prehensile tail does is allow the seahorse to anchor itself to plants and rocks, preventing itself from getting tossed around by the current, which again it wouldn't need to do if it didn't lack fins. Now, they do have pretty solid armor, which can make them difficult to actually take out, but their extreme lack of mobility means the seahorse cannot dodge attacks. This leads them to getting smacked around by any player who feels like it, even ones without any special combat perks. And with their best matchup being against Plankton, to me there's no way the seahorse places any higher than F tier. Also in F tier we have the ocean sunfish. This probably isn't too shocking given that the sunfish is famously bad at defending itself. But for those unaware, the ocean sunfish has the highest HP stat of any fish in the game and relies on its giant size for protection. Similar to the seahorse, the sunfish's other stats are all extremely low, and because of this, the sunfish gets bullied hard by many of the common marine threats, both large and small. They get torn to bits and tossed around particularly badly by the mammalian player base. Sea lions and orcas in particular love flexing their superiority over the largest fish build in the game. But the sunfish has another huge weakness: parasites. See, the sunfish has soft, mucus-coated skin instead of the scales traditionally used by fish players. This makes the sunfish more vulnerable to parasites, which unfortunately means that even the best sunfish mains have to play while suffering from a wide variety of debuffs from parasite infestations. The sunfish players often solicit the help of support mains like the wrasse and shrimp to help cleanse themselves, and may even sit at the water's surface to give bird mains the chance to attack the parasites. The gigantism strategy is usually a pretty reliable strategy for avoiding attacks. Elephants, whales, hippos, and rhinos are generally safe from attacks once they reach their max size. However, I think in order to make the strategy work, you need to actually be able to strike back to discourage repeated attacks. Otherwise, you're kinda just a damage sponge and will have your HP slowly whittled down, as we often see happen to the sunfish mains. So because of all these vulnerabilities and over-reliance on support players for help, I have to place the ocean sunfish in F tier. The flying fish is a build with an extremely unique playstyle centered around maximizing mobility. By putting a huge amount of evolution points into their fin trait and mobility stat, they've actually gained the ability to glide through the air for surprisingly long distances. This is useful as an escape option when being attacked by a larger fish player. However, as unique a move as this is, I actually think this is a pretty poor strategy overall. Being airborne might put you out of range of an attack from another fish, but it's by no means a safe position, and in many cases is actually seriously disadvantageous. Without any way to dodge attacks midair, flying fish are extremely vulnerable to bird attacks, which kinda nullifies the benefit of escaping an aquatic pursuer. And in addition, with no way to change direction mid-air, it's actually not that difficult for said fish player to just intercept the flying fish's landing. So overall, not that useful of an ability, tacked onto an otherwise unremarkable build. Also in D tier we have the Salmon family, which includes the fish builds like the Trout and the Char. This build actually has some pretty impressive stats, with high mobility being pretty much required in order to withstand the constant rushing flow of the rivers that they use as their respawn points. Similar to the flying fish, this playstyle is also highly vulnerable to disruption from non-aquatic players. As impressive as it is that salmon and trout mains are able to make these insane jumps, the sad truth is that the thing that they're most well known for is being an easy source of XP for carnivore players. Now, this jumping ability is also useful for attacking flying builds mid-air, but the salmon's power stat isn't quite enough to be able to take down anything that isn't far below their weight class. At the bottom of C tier, we have the Catfish, one of the tankier builds on this list with a bulky yet versatile stat spread. A lot of players undervalue the Catfish and see it as low-tier trash due to it being a bottom feeder, not realizing that they've actually got a few decent unique abilities, most important of which is their venom. Rather than speccing their fin appendages to do things like flying or flexing, the Catfish build specced into fins that have barbs on them, which can deliver a venomous sting. While their venom usually isn't able to deal lethal damage, it's still a decent defensive ability. It does have its weaknesses though, particularly to long, disjointed hitboxes, such as the spear-like beaks of some bird builds. Nonetheless, the Catfish is still a reliable and easy-to-play build, being omnivorous and able to gain plenty of XP simply by digging through the mud for scraps. Also in C tier we have the Archer Fish, the only fish build with the ability to use a ranged attack. This projectile deals essentially 0 damage, but it's by no means useless. This projectile has high knockback, making it excellent for pushing players into vulnerable positions. A waterlogged insect is one of the easiest targets in the game, and being able to force that type of interaction is an extremely powerful ability. This ability does have its limitations though. As is the case with most projectiles, this attack is unusable in the water, meaning that the Archerfish doesn't really have any good moves for PvP against other aquatic players. I think the biggest weakness of this playstyle though is the position that you're forced into in order to make use of your projectile weapon. Being near the surface of the water leaves you vulnerable to both attacks from below and above, and with no defense against either, the Archerfish is a high-risk, decent reward build. In B tier we have the builds that are generally solid picks, but lack any truly overpowered abilities. First is the Bass, the poster child for the phrase, big fish in a small pond. With solid stats and the ability to grow larger than most other freshwater lake fish, the bass can easily dominate their local scene, even to the point of depleting the area of resources by gobbling them all up. Their generalist nature and large jaws mean they can prey upon just about anything from smaller fish to crustaceans to even builds like frogs and alligators. While there's not that much that's flashy or unique about this strategy, there's no denying that the bass is a consistent threat in the pond meta, and I consider them the gatekeepers of the higher tiers. Also in B tier we have the fish faction's premier support class, the Cleaner Wrasse. The Cleaner Wrasse specializes in cleansing larger fish players of parasites, providing an extremely useful service in the form of removing debuffs from any fish player in need, similar to the Oxpecker on land. Parasites are a major threat to fish players, so it's no surprise that oftentimes even top tier builds like Sharks will add Cleaner Wrasse players to their party. Wrasse do have to rely on their reputation to protect them though, and while betrayals during cleansing sessions are rare, swimming into a mouthful of dagger-like teeth is not without risk. Alright, now we're in A tier and this is where things start to get a bit overpowered. First, we have the Pickerel Guild, which includes the Pike and Muskellunge, the most fearsome freshwater fish in the game. These vicious fish builds are highly aggressive and attack anything in or around their domain, from fish to birds to mammals and even humans. Their powerful jaws sport sharp crocodile-esque teeth, which deal serious damage and grip their target, preventing their escape. But it's not just about power with these fish. Their slender body and camouflage allow them to easily hide in cover, waiting for the perfect ambush opportunity. And unlike trout, when these fish jump, it's not just to clear an obstacle, they jump to attack. Their only weakness is a slow growth rate and long respawn timer, but even at low levels, these fish are adept hunters. While not part of the Pickerel Guild, I also include the Barracuda in this same rating, as they have a very similar playstyle. Giant size is not a requirement to be a high tier predator though, as exemplified by the next build on this list, the Piranha. Piranhas are one of the best, if not the best, example of how with the right combination of special abilities and team strategies, size genuinely doesn't matter. Their special ability, Feeding Frenzy, boosts Piranha Shoal DPS to one of the highest in the game, able to absolutely melt through the HP of even the tankiest targets. In contrast to the Salmon and Trout, because of their favorable matchup against larger players, Piranhas are the only fish build on this list that I think actually make great use of its positional advantage in rivers, as many mammals and birdmains will be forced to cross your territory over the course of their playthrough and fall victim to your frenzy attacks. Their main weakness is a lack of defensive capability, meaning that they can still be easily one-shot by other predator players. The next build on this tier list does not share this weakness. The Lionfish is one of the most well-defended fish builds in the game, relying on a huge arsenal of venomous spines to deal serious damage to attackers, similar to the Porcupine build on land. Because of this, the Lionfish is an infamously unpleasant target to attack, and most predator players tend to either ignore or actively avoid them. While their other stats are quite low, this certainly hasn't stopped them from rising to dominance in their home server of the Indo-Pacific. Lionfish are also generalists, who gobble up anything that their low mobility stat allows them to catch, which can quickly deplete a server of its resources. And because of their quick respawn rate, lionfish have rapidly spread to other ocean servers without much pushback, at least until they reach the tropical Atlantic. See, there is one fish build that has been able to consistently take down lionfish, and once I show you how broken some of their abilities are, it'll be easy to understand why. We've got 2 more builds to showcase in S tier, but real quick, I just want to point out that this is the longest video I've made so far, and took a huge amount of time and resources to produce. So if you're enjoying it and want more content like this, please do consider subscribing. Thanks! The Moray eel is one of the most uniquely powerful fish in the game, with a set of strange yet highly functional abilities and well-placed base stat allocations. So first, their stats. While the highest aquatic power rating falls to sharks and whales, a close runner-up is the moray. Their teeth resemble broken glass and can do similarly brutal damage in combat. Their mobility is surprisingly high for a fish that lacks pectoral and pelvic fins, but in addition to having great maneuverability in the tight spaces of a reef, they're capable of some pretty impressive bursts of speed too. Their stealth may seem low due to their vibrant coloring, but honestly, bright colors are everywhere in reef servers, so they don't stick out too much. In fact, their ability to contort and fit into crevices and other tight spaces gives them a pretty huge advantage for ambushing other players. Where things get interesting though is with their defense. The moray has a slime-based special ability, which serves multiple defensive purposes. It protects them from taking abrasion and puncture damage while passing through sharp coral and jagged spaces within the reef. But perhaps more surprisingly, it's great at deflecting damage from things like teeth and spikes. Not only does this give them a great matchup against sharks, but it also makes them one of the only builds in the game capable of taking down the lionfish. This excellent matchup spread makes placing the moray eel in S tier an easy decision. The final build on this tier list is the billfish. This includes the marlin, swordfish, and sailfish, all of which have similar playstyles. This group is top tier for 2 reasons. First is that they have the highest swim speed in the game, beating out not just all other fish, but also mammals and birds. In addition to having unmatched speed, their large dorsal fins allow them to make tighter turns than most fish too, making them extremely good at chasing down prey. Their most unique trait, however, is their bill, one of the strangest offensive abilities in the game. Useful for both slashing and stabbing, this attack is one of the few in the game able to hit multiple targets at once. This makes it excellent for countering the ubiquitous safety in numbers strategy many fish players adopt. And since the billfish hunt in packs, they can rack up insane kill counts, rivaling the hunting prowess of even a pot of dolphins. With busted stats and a signature move that's both flashy and downright broken, to me there's no question that the billfish is the most overpowered fish build in the game. Regardless of where your favorite fish build falls on the tier list, one thing's for sure. Adaptation is key to survivability in the current meta, and it's important to always be exploring new strategies to stay ahead of the curve.